I believe interior design is one of the most rewarding skills you can learn because it changes how you feel in your home every single day. And I think for a lot of people, that's the whole point, because we all want a space that actually supports our lives, not just something that looks good in photos. But there's a lot that goes into getting a room to click, from where you get your ideas, to how you plan, to what you do when you're standing in the room and something still feels off. So in this video, I want to share the biggest lessons I've learned, not just about style or shopping, but about how to actually approach your space so you can make better decisions and waste less money. And if you stick around until the end, you'll know exactly what to fix before you buy anything else. So the first thing we need to talk about is that most people think they're learning design when they're actually just collecting images. They spend hours scrolling, saving, organizing Pinterest boards, and telling themselves they're doing research. And on the surface, it feels productive, like you're refining your taste and narrowing in on what you like. But there's a quiet gap that starts to form, and most people don't notice it until they try to apply what they've saved to their own space and something feels off. Because at some point, you realize you've seen thousands of rooms, but you still don't really understand why some rooms work, even when nothing in them is particularly impressive. And that's where people usually assume they just need better inspiration. But that assumption is the problem, because social media is great for inspiration, but you don't want to rely on it exclusively, since it's almost impossible to understand from a single photo how a space feels at night, how sound bounces around the room, or how it holds up once someone actually lives there. And that's why the most valuable design lessons don't come from images at all. They come from being inside real spaces. Friends' apartments, older homes, hotels, Airbnbs, and especially spaces where people aren't trying to impress anyone. Because when you're physically in a room, you start noticing things photos can't capture. Things like the true scale of the furniture, how light shifts throughout the day, where clutter naturally accumulates, and which parts of the room feel comfortable or awkward. And you also start to notice how fast your body reacts before your brain does. You feel when a chair is slightly too low, when a hallway is too tight, or when a room feels relaxing for reasons you can't immediately explain. Those reactions are really valuable feedback because they're telling you what works and what doesn't long before you can even articulate why. But for now, spending time in real spaces also lets you pay attention to how people actually use their homes. Where do they sit without thinking about it? What parts of the room never get used? Which rooms feel relaxing and which feel tense? So think about this stuff the next time you're at a friend's house, because some of the best insights you'll find come from spaces that aren't designed at all. So that's tip number one. If you want to get better at interior design, spend less time saving images on Instagram and Pinterest and more time observing the real physical spaces you spend time in. Because experience teaches you things inspiration never will. Now, the next place people quietly get stuck is when they start treating shopping like progress. Because buying something feels productive. It's like you're solving a problem with your wallet. And when a room doesn't feel right, the most obvious conclusion is that it's missing something. So people go looking for the right sofa, the perfect table, or a statement lamp that's supposed to pull the room together. And sometimes, if you're lucky, that one purchase actually helps. But most of the time, it just makes your room more confusing. But what's tricky is that nothing you buy feels wrong on its own. Because each piece looks good in isolation, and it makes sense when you're scrolling online. And that's why people end up with rooms full of nice things that somehow still feel oddly unfinished. Because at some point, you realize the problem isn't the quality of the objects, it's how those objects relate to each other. Because a room isn't the sum of its parts, it's the relationship between them. And that's why scale, spacing, proportion, light, and restraint matter more than any single object ever will. Because a beautiful chair can still feel awkward if it's the wrong size, just as an expensive table can feel cheap if it's crowded by everything else in the room. And when you look at rooms that really work, that's usually what's happening. The pieces themselves aren't loud, and nothing is trying to prove anything, but everything feels considered because the relationships were prioritized before the objects. So that's tip number two. A beautiful object does not equal a beautiful room. So stop chasing individual pieces and start paying attention to how everything works together. Now, another place people run into issues is right after they think they've done everything correctly. They've researched, they've saved the images, even though I told them not to, and they've narrowed down a style. And on paper, it all makes sense. If you looked at their Pinterest boards, you'd probably say, yeah, this looks good. But then they try to recreate that look in their own home, and something doesn't quite click. And this can be frustrating because if they're trying to copy that look in their own space, they're often doing everything right. They buy similar furniture, they match the colors, and they follow the layout as closely as possible. But the room still feels off. Not bad enough to point to one obvious mistake, but not right enough to feel finished either. And that's usually when people assume they just need to try harder, save more images, find better references, and dial in that style even further. But the real issue isn't a lack of inspiration, it's how that inspiration is being used. Because the images you save were never meant to be copied, they're moments in time. Highly specific spaces designed around proportions, light, and constraints that probably don't match your home at all. And when you try to recreate them inch by inch, you're forcing your space to behave like something it isn't. So what actually works is something subtler. Because inspiration isn't replication, it's pattern recognition. You're not supposed to copy the sofa, the lamp, and the exact layout. You're supposed to notice what keeps showing up across the spaces you're drawn to. The restraint in the color palettes, the use of negative space, the contrast of materials, or whatever it is that keeps showing up across the spaces you like. Because once you understand the underlying ideas, you can look at your own space and determine what you need to do. And so then, your room's proportions matter, its light matters, its quirks matter, because a room with low ceilings needs a different solution than a room with tall ones. And a north-facing apartment behaves differently from a sun-flooded corner unit, and no image on the internet can account for that. And this is why copying other spaces usually ends in disappointment. You do everything right, but the room still doesn't feel right. And that's because design isn't about assembling parts, it's about interpretation. So the places you draw inspiration from should inform your decisions, not dictate them. So that's tip number 3. Use inspiration as a starting point, but not a blueprint. And by the way, if you want to learn how to read your own space based on its layout, light, and constraints, I built a set of tools and frameworks to help with exactly that. So there's a link in the description. Now, the first thing you need to know about this next tip is that most bad design decisions don't actually come from bad taste. They come from ideas that never get a chance to meet. Let me explain. We've all got different design ideas floating in different parts of our life. One idea lives in your head, another lives in a screenshot you took last week, and another shows up in a store when something catches your eye. And that's totally normal. But because none of those ideas are living side by side, everything feels compatible until they actually meet, because that's when the disconnect shows up. For example, let's say you had an idea for the color you want on your walls, took a screenshot of a couch you saw on Instagram, and then stumbled upon a lamp at a vintage furniture market. In your head, they might seem like the perfect mix, but when you get them all in the same space, the colors don't agree, the contrast is awful, and the space just feels bad all around. So even though you love the 3 ideas on their own, you've designed a room for yourself that doesn't really work at all. And what's happening here is fragmentation. You're making design decisions in isolation without seeing how they interact with each other. But once those decisions are physically in your space, it's too late to pretend they're unrelated. And this is where things go sideways, because people assume the fix is having more discipline. But the real issue isn't self-control, it's visibility. So here's the practical fix. Before you buy anything, you need to collect all your ideas in one place. Not 5 different apps, not scrolling through your screenshots and camera roll. I mean one place where you can see everything together all at once. So that's your inspiration images, room measurements, layout ideas, materials you're considering, your lighting plan, all of it visible at the same time. And then, before you buy anything, you just do one simple check. Does this idea still make sense next to everything else? Because when you do that, the problems show up immediately. You notice the warm wood sitting next to the cool metal. You see the minimal furniture paired with all the busy patterns you love. And you realize the layout you liked online totally ignores how people actually move through your room. And this is all good, because those contradictions are so much cheaper to fix before you buy everything rather than after. So I know a lot of people think planning kills creativity, but it actually does the opposite. It gives you constraints, but as long as you stay within them, you can be as creative as you want, which is how you come to some really cool outcomes. So that's tip number 4. Organize your ideas before you buy anything. Your wallet will thank you later. Now, another one of the most common pressures people feel, even if they don't say it out loud, is the need to make a room feel done as fast as possible. The furniture arrives and suddenly there's this invisible deadline. The walls feel bare, the corners feel empty, and that emptiness starts to feel like a problem that needs solving. So people rush to fill it. Art on every wall, decor on every surface, and something in every corner just so the room looks complete. And on the surface, that feels productive. But that urgency is usually what creates cluttered, over-designed spaces that just don't age well. Because good rooms almost never come together all at once. They evolve. They respond to how you actually live in them. And when you rush to fill space, you're making decisions without context. You don't yet know where you naturally sit or how the light moves throughout the day. And that's the part most people miss. Empty space isn't automatically a problem. It only becomes a problem when you treat it like one. Because leaving parts of your room unfinished for a while creates breathing room, both visually and mentally. And it gives you time to notice what the space is asking for instead of forcing an answer. Like, sometimes that blank wall doesn't need art. Sometimes it just needs light hitting it at the right time of day. And sometimes a corner doesn't need a chair, it really just needs nothing at all. Plus, there's also a very real financial upside to slowing down, because rushed decisions usually turn into filler purchases, the things you buy to relieve discomfort, not because they truly belong. And in the long run, those are the pieces that get replaced, resold, or just shoved into storage. So slowing down almost always leads to fewer, but better decisions. So you have to get comfortable living with a bit of incompleteness. And that's not failure, that's part of the process. Some of the nicest homes you'll ever step into feel good precisely because they aren't constantly trying to prove something. Instead, they leave room for life to happen inside them. So that's tip number 5. Be okay with leaving things unfinished. Now, another trap people fall into is trying to make a room work by leaning on one big idea. One statement wall, one bold light fixture, one hero piece that's supposed to carry the entire space. And on paper, it sounds clean and decisive, but in real life, it usually feels flat, or worse, performative. Because rooms don't feel good because of one loud decision. They feel good because of many quiet decisions working together. And that's why you want to stop thinking in statement pieces and start thinking in layers. So instead of asking what should stand out, ask what your room should feel like to spend time in, and then build up the layers you need to create that kind of an atmosphere. Now, for most rooms, the easiest way to apply this concept of layers is with lighting. Overhead light for function, side lighting for depth, and low light for mood. When you set up your room that way, no single fixture needs to do all the work, but the result is a well-layered room that feels good every hour of the day. And then comes material layering, soft layered on top of hard, matte layered on top of reflective, and warm layered on top of neutral. This may sound like a lot now, but the more experience you gain here, the more naturally this will come to you. And by the way, this is where restraint really matters, because designing with layers doesn't mean adding in more stuff. It means being thoughtful about every single decision, because a room with layered lighting, textures, and materials will always feel richer than a room built around one loud feature surrounded by emptiness. So that's tip number 6. Think in layers, not statement pieces. Now, another mistake people make is assuming good design is universal. They see something that works online and they assume it'll work the same in their space. But it won't, because context changes everything. Where you live matters, climate matters, light matters, noise matters. Because a space that feels cozy in a cold, dim environment can feel heavy and suffocating somewhere warm. And in the same way, open layouts that look gorgeous in photos can feel chaotic if you work from home or really value your quiet time. And then there's cultural context, because how people gather, eat, relax, and move through space is different all over the world. And ignoring those differences creates a ton of friction. You end up fighting your home instead of being supported by it, constantly adjusting things that never quite feel right. And then there's the lifestyle layer. Do you cook often, entertain people, work late, or wake up early? Your answers to those questions should influence the layout, lighting, storage, and even color choices you make, because a beautiful home that doesn't align with how you live will never quite feel like yours. Because good design is responsive to its environment. So remember that when you're taking ideas from other sources, they need to fit into their new environment which is your space. So that's tip number 7. Design for your context. Now, another quiet trap is treating your home like it needs to be finished and then preserved. Because a lot of people chase a kind of visual perfection where everything looks styled, untouched, and camera ready. And once they get close to that ideal, they become super protective of it. They become afraid to move things, afraid to use things, and afraid to disrupt the image they worked so hard to create. The problem is that perfection doesn't feel comfortable. It feels staged, because real homes change over time. They collect scuffs and adapt to routines. And that's not a failure. That's what gives them character. But when you design with perfection as the goal, your space starts to feel tense. And so it looks good, but it doesn't relax you. And so what you find is that some of the most inviting homes feel good precisely because they're a little imperfect. A chair with frayed arms from years of use, or a layout that prioritizes comfort over symmetry. Because designing for real life means accepting that things will evolve. Your tastes will change and your needs will shift. And so your space should be allowed to respond instead of being frozen in a single moment in time. Because once you let go of the perfection ideal, your home stops feeling like a project and starts feeling like a place you can actually live. So that's tip number 8. Stop chasing perfection. So at the end of the day, all of these tips are really pointing to the same thing. Most people aren't struggling because they lack taste. They're struggling because they're trying to design from images, purchases, and isolated decisions instead of real feedback from real spaces. Because there's no doubt that social media can give us ideas, but it won't teach us how a room behaves. But once you start paying attention to behavior, so things like how light moves, where people naturally gravitate toward, and what parts of a room feel tight or relaxed, you stop designing like you're building with Lego blocks, and you start designing like you're building an atmosphere from the ground up. But honestly, this was a hard video to condense because there are so many more mistakes and patterns I could talk about, but I didn't want to make this 3 hours long. So if you think I missed something major, drop it in the comments because it'll help shape what videos I make in the future. And if you want to dive deeper into these ideas and start applying them in your own space, I've developed some pretty unique tools to help you do exactly that, and the link for those is in the description. But now that you've got a few new ways to think about your space, the next thing you need is a framework that ties it all together. So watch this video next where I'll walk you through a system I built that makes one of your most important design decisions feel crystal clear and way easier to get right.